All right, everybody, welcome back to Contend 5, or Week 5 of Contend. We're talking about the communicable attributes of God, ways we're supposed to be like God. And on the one hand, this could be a near infinite list as you look at every single command in the New Testament somehow is corresponding to an attribute of God or a characteristic of God that we're called to therefore imitate. But so what we're going to look at here is like a variety of ways of summarizing God's attributes, of categorizing his attributes, and some of the more significant ones that it's good for us to have at the top of our mind. And so first, what is communicability in the first place? Well, Ephesians 5:1 says, be imitators of God. That kind of summarizes the whole moral law, is be like God and don't be like false gods. Don't bear false witness about God's character with your character. On the other hand, we see as God's image bearers, Genesis 1, let us make man in our image after our likeness, that we are supposed to be like God. Now, last week we talked about all the ways we're not supposed to be like God, but first we're going to talk about the ways we are supposed to be like God. And this is the first one I want to talk about, which might sound a little bit surprising, is existence. We exist because God exists. That's one of the ways that we are like God. And so you probably don't need argument for the fact that God exists, but there's something about essence and existence that go hand in hand, right? So essence, there's the what of something. Existence is the is of something. And the sense in which, here's why this is important, is God is not merely real, he's actually the most real. He was the eternally existing one, the pre-existent one, the one that everything else exists contingent of, that without which there is nothing. The sine qua non is the Latin word for that all other things that exist because of God. So in that sense, he's the most real. He exists the weightiest. He's the most glorious, significant being that is there. And so debates about God's existence is almost as silly as debates about the moon's existence. And I would say more silly, because it is possible that the moon would not exist. It is not possible that God would not exist. That's why Genesis 1:1 opens up, in the beginning God. It's not an argument. It's just an assertion. Very few people nowadays I would say, are like cold atheists. Most people acknowledge some type of higher power, usually talking about how knowable is God, to what extent can you know God, things like that. So God exists necessarily, everything else is contingently. But I do want to give you 4 arguments for God's existence that are most common throughout church history. Number 1 is called the cosmological argument. Everything has a cause in the cosmos. There must therefore be a first cause. The unmoved mover is another way of talking about that. Everything that happens because something caused it to happen. There had to be something that moved first. That leads you to God. Again, these arguments don't really lead you to believe in the person Jesus Christ, incarnate Son of God, but they do kind of help you kind of begin to see the sense in which Romans 1 says, what can be known about God is made plain to them in the creation. So these are revelatory, general revelation things, not necessarily special revelation things. Number 2, the teleological argument. This is like the watchmaker argument. The universe appears to be designed with a purpose. There must be a designer who gave it that purpose. You know, if you were walking through the jungle and found a watch, you would not think, wow, this grew here on its own. This arose of its own random mutations. You'd say, no, this came from someone designed this. This does not naturally occur. This does not naturally arise. Same with the universe. There must be a designer. The third one's ontological argument. This one's almost this is a bit of a mind bender for people who didn't spend a lot of time studying philosophy, but this is ontos, is the word being in Greek. So there must be a being greater than which nothing can be imagined, or the greatest of all beings. So imagine the greatest of all beings that's greater than every other being. Okay, well, that has to exist because there must be a greatest being, but existence must belong to that being, since existence is a positive quality. Therefore, God must exist because a greatest conceivable being must exist, and that is what we're talking about. We're talking about God. And so that one gets a lot of play, especially like Rene Descartes in the medieval times. And most philosophers see it as airtight. Practically, it's not very useful in the sauna or at your parent-teacher conference. The fourth one is the moral argument. This is like the one C.S. Lewis is most famous for. There's an innate and universal sense of right and wrong, a desire for justice. C.S. Lewis gives the example in Mere Christianity about how if you're getting onto the bus and someone accidentally trips you, you're not like full of anger at that person. But if you get onto a bus and someone tries to trip you but fails, you are inherently angry at that person, and how from like a purely Darwinian view, why would one of those, like, the pain caused by the accidental trip is higher, from like a threat to your being perspective, but the intention or like the heart behind it. So there's like a sense of justice that's present naturally. And Darwinism, evolution thought, neo-Darwinism, these things give no rise to morals. And so within the universe, science can only give you that which is. It can't tell you what ought to be. And morals are what ought to be. And so if you believe that there are moral oughts, there must be a moral author that is the judge of those things. We're called to exist like God exists. We exist like God. That's a communicable attribute, existence. Knowability is another one. We can know God truly, but not fully. This is true for me as well. You can know me truly, but not fully. I can know myself truly, but not fully. Only God can fully know me and fully know himself. So God can know God truly and fully. God can know you truly and fully. But when someone lacks integrity, it's because people don't know them truly. They've been misrepresenting themselves. But in community, in our lives, we want people to know us truly, but only certain people to know us fully. And that takes prudence and wisdom in that. So on God's unknowability, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. Psalm 139:6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. So there's a sense in which God is unknowable. You cannot fully ever know him, even in the next life. But there's also a sense in which he's revealed himself, that we can know him truly. God has shown it to them, Romans 1:19. Matthew 11:27, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So people to whom God reveals himself can know him truly, but it requires revelation of God. And so there are things we can infer about God's existence from the creation, his invisible attributes or his incommunicable attributes, but his personal attributes, his communicable attributes, need to be revealed to us. You can't look at creation and learn that God is love. You can, however, look at the dying cross and learn that God is love. You can read the book of Isaiah and learn that God is love. And so certain attributes of God must be revealed by God to us personally, but also through salvation history. So the first bucket of attributes, or the next bucket of attributes we're going to look at, is called the attributes of being, his spirituality or his invisibility. And these are, again, ways that the Mormon faith departs from Orthodox Christianity. They don't see God as spirit. They don't see God as invisible. So when we say God's spirituality, we don't mean that like God likes to do yoga, like some people say I'm spiritual, not religious, and they like doing yoga. We're talking about is that he is non-corporeal or non-physical. God's spirituality means that God exists as a being that is not made of any matter, has no parts or dimensions, is unable to be perceived by our bodily senses, and is more excellent than any other kind of existence. The most explicit place this is taught is John 4:24, or 1 John 4:24. John 4:24. God is spirit. Is the woman at the well saying, like, we worship there, you worship there, and God goes, God is everywhere. He's not bound by space. If he's not bound by space, that means he does not have a body. And so Mormons teach that the Father has a body. That's false. That's nowhere taught in Scripture. There are metaphors that describe him, but he is spiritual. God is spirit. He's has no parts or dimensions. He's universally present everywhere. The Son takes on a body in the incarnation. We'll talk about that later. But God in his being is spirit. Invisibility, this goes hand in hand. God's invisibility means that God's total essence, all of his spiritual being, will never be able to be seen by us. Yet God still shows himself to us partially in this age and more fully in the age to come. So here's some texts that argue for that. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. They shall see his face. The nature of seeing, we'll not know what it'll be like until we reach heaven. So there is this like God dwells in unapproachable light thing, that there's a sense in which we see that right in the book of Exodus. Again, we'll talk about this in the Trinity in the next section, but where it says no one's ever seen God, but then it says in the next couple verses that Moses saw God face to face, and then a couple verses after that, God says Moses can't look at my face or he'll die. So which one is it? Well, we can see like contours or see around and see the light or see the glory, or see like aspects of God's character. We can't see him fully. He is incorporeal. He is non-physical. And so he like manifests himself to us in unapproachable light through burning bush, chiefly in the person of Jesus, takes on flesh, but in and of himself, he is invisible. The next bucket of attributes is called the mental attributes. Knowledge, which we covered in the last section on omniscience, especially as refutation of open theism. Wisdom and truthfulness. So right here, we'll just cover wisdom and truthfulness, but know that in some classifications, omniscience would go with knowledge here in mental. So wisdom is pretty straightforward. God always chooses the best goals and the best means to those goals. I wish I was like that. I should be more like that. You should be more like that. Have the right aims and the right strategies for those aims. God is wise. With God are wisdom and might. He has counsel and understanding. Job 12:13. Next one is God's truthfulness or his reliability. God is the true God, and all his knowledge and words are both true and the final standard for truth. God will always do what he has said and fulfill what he has promised. You should be more like that. I should be more like that. You can bet on God. You should be able to bet on me. Reliability, truthfulness is one of the ways we bear witness to God's character. Then the last bucket would be called like the moral attributes, or the second to last bucket, the moral attributes of God. Goodness, love, mercy, holiness, peace, righteousness, jealousy, and wrath. Now, remember at the end of the last section, we talked about the simplicity of God, meaning if you took away any one of these attributes, he would cease to be God. If God was no longer loving, if God was no longer wrathful, if God was no longer righteous, these aren't just kind of like adding characteristics to this independent being, but these are all inherently part of who God is. And so I want to go through these, throw a verse or two, define them, and round these out. But if you want to do a deeper study on these, you could spend your whole life adding verses to these. So goodness of God. God is the final standard of good. Tov is the Hebrew word. And all that God is and does is worthy of approval. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Psalm 106. God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31. God is good. He does good. It's not that God appeals to some standard of good outside of himself, but he created the standard of goodness, and he lives by the standard of goodness. When we don't walk in that similar goodness, we wound other people, we bear false witness to God. And so much of like the tension we feel in our own lives is when there's suffering in our lives and it feels to conflict with God's goodness. But actually that tension arises out of the fact that we believe that he's good. Goodness is a big one, and it extends into these next three: mercy, grace / patience. These are types of God's goodness. God's mercy is God's goodness towards those in misery. God's grace is God's goodness towards those who deserve punishment. God's patience is God's goodness in withholding that punishment toward those who sin over a period of time. I need mercy, I need grace, I need patience. All of this is good news to me. It's part of God's goodness. Likewise, we're called to be merciful, gracious, and patient. Love. I love Grudem's definition here of this. God's love means that God eternally gives of himself to others. He was doing that before the foundation of the world. John 17:24 says that. And he's also doing it to us now, to be self-giving, to give yourself away in affection. Holiness is the next one. Holiness can be like a super religious sounding word. What does it mean to be holy? Grudem hits two prongs here in his definition that I think are helpful. God's holiness means that he's separated from sin and devoted to seeking his own honor. I'd probably define it slightly different. I'd say God's holiness is his devotion to righteousness. And his righteousness also includes his separation from sin, and his righteousness also includes being jealous for his own honor. But most basically, like the famous passage in Isaiah 6, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. We get a definition of holiness in Isaiah 5:16. The Lord of hosts is exalted in justice. The holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. That his absolute unwavering commitment to righteousness is what makes him holy. That's why when sinners stand before the holy God, it's scary. That's why we trust him to do what is right all the time, is his commitment and his devotion to righteousness. You could call holiness devotion, is maybe a less religious word to it. Like if you're devoted to something, you're in it all the way. Holiness is devotion, and it's being devoted to God such that you're unstained from and unaffected by and separated from sin. But it's also like a commitment to God's purposes in the world. So holiness is about devotion to righteousness. God is actually devoted to his own way, just like we're called to be devoted to the Lord. On justice and righteousness, you can see that in Isaiah 5:16, that passage, exalted in justice, shown in righteousness. Actually, in Hebrew and Greek, the word righteous and justice are the same word. We use it in English, kind of a different senses. Like righteousness is like the proactive, justice is a bit like the responsive. Like someone, if everyone did righteousness, there'd be no need to do justice. But because people do unrighteousness, then like the responsive work of justice is needed. So that's why courts are not called the righteousness system. They're called the justice system, trying to evaluate what was right and what was wrong, and then to bring about consequences necessarily. So these are the same concept here, that God always does what is right. God's righteousness means that God always acts in accordance with what is right and is himself the final standard of what is right. And so that's proactive righteousness, God always doing what is right. And then the responsive righteousness or justice is God responding rightly to unrighteousness or righteousness. So that's another way of saying he's a good judge, the good justice piece. He judges rightly. Next one is peace or order. God's peace means that in God's being and in his actions, he is separate from all confusion and disorder. Yet he is continually active in innumerable, well-ordered, fully controlled, simultaneous actions. So when something's at peace, we're talking about like coherence or order. God's not a God of confusion. He doesn't stir up confusion, but there's like a rightly ordered thing to all that he does. His plan of salvation is simple. He's simple within himself, and he's not sending mixed messages in his scriptures. The next one is jealousy. God continually seeks to protect his own honor. We might ask, like, to what extent should we be jealous, right? Because if this is a communicable attribute, I thought we're not supposed to be jealous. Well, we are supposed to be jealous for God's honor. Like I remember my mother recently was talking about this person who kind of on Instagram was going on this rant about how they've improved their life and that's so much better and be like me and blah, blah, blah. And my first thought reading that was like, oh, good for him. But then my mom was frustrated by it. She's like, he didn't give credit to the Lord. He didn't thank the Lord for the capacity, he didn't thank the Lord for help. He didn't thank the Lord for self-control. He didn't thank the Lord for a wife who called him out in the first place. It was just kind of this self-glorification. And she was mad. And I think she was more righteous than I was in her emotions responding to that thing, because she was likewise jealous for God's honor and seeing him as being deserving of honor and glory, where I just kind of thought like, oh, good for him, he changed. She was like, yeah, but also he's like stealing God's glory, and that made her mad. And so we should be jealous for God's glory in our own lives, not trying to steal it or sneak in on it. Wrath is the next one. God intensely hates all sin. That really is downstream from his love, downstream from his righteousness. You see how if you take like a loving God who loves righteousness and the harm that sin does to ourselves and other people, like wrath inherently flows from that. You kind of have to have wrath if you have love. You kind of have to have wrath if you have justice. You kind of have to have justice if you have wrath and love. And so this is what we mean by the simplicity of God, is all these things kind of go together and balance each other out and help you, like they're all different windows into the one being of God. God hates all sin. Why? Because he loves. The times I've been the most harsh with other people's kids is when they're harming my kids. Why? Because I love. I'm not saying I was fully righteous in every situation, but I'm saying the times where I've been the most like stirred up under wrath have been when people are harming or I perceive what they're harming, what I love the most. It's the same with God. The next three, the last three are the attributes of purpose. These aren't the last three, I'm sorry. These are the attributes of purpose. Then the last ones will be the summary attributes. Will, freedom, and power. God's will. God approves and determines to bring about every action necessary for the existence and creativity and activity of himself and all creation. That God does have desires. He acts on those desires. He has a will. He makes plans. This is one of the ways we imitate God, is we have a will. One of the things that's kind of a marker of someone being unhealthy is if they don't have a will. What do you want for your future? I don't know. What do you want in this relationship? I don't know. What do you want for dinner tonight? I don't know. That part of being a person is having a will and seeking to act on it, obviously in consideration of other people. But to will something, to want things, is part of being like God. Now, God's will is a complicated, layered thing. I remember in high school, my mentor assigned this project and said, I want each of you to think about, is it true that God's will is always done? True or false? And half of us came back and said true, half of us came back and said false. I said true. I thought the people who said false were heretics because open theism and God being sovereign over the world. But what I realized was we all lacked an insufficient understanding of God's will, that there's these meaningful distinctions within God's will that we need to be aware of. Number one is God's necessary will versus his free will. God's necessary will are the things which emanate from his character by necessity or contingently. It must happen. The other thing is God's free will. God's in the heavens, he does whatever he pleases, right? So God's necessary will is he must act in justice, he must act in righteousness. But his free will are like his choice to save, his choice to create. God had free will in that sense. But it's necessary that God be loved because he's eternally and perfectly loving. It's necessary that God act in his immutability. God can't will himself to change because he's unchangeable, but his desire to act in history, that's his free will. The other distinction is his secret versus his revealed will. Deuteronomy 29:29 says the secret things belong to the Lord, and the revealed will are the things that God has demonstratedly act in history. And related to that are this is getting at the question that my mentor asked. There's God's will of decree or his decretive will, which corresponds to the secret will. Then there's his moral will or his will for us. So in 1 Corinthians it says it's God's will that you be sexually pure. That's an example of God's moral will. God's will of decree is that he ordains all things that come to pass. And so God's will of decree or his secret will is always accomplished. His revealed will or his moral will is sometimes accomplished when people obey him. And so there are plenty of examples in scriptures where people don't do God's will. What they're not doing is God's moral or revealed will. And there are other times where it says, whatever God ordained to come pass, that happened. That's his will of decree, his providential will, or his secret will. And so you can see those different senses appearing in scripture. Freedom, God does whatever he pleases. That one's pretty straightforward. We talked about it earlier. And then there's his summary attributes: perfection, happiness, beauty, and glory. Happiness in particular, I'm excited to talk about. So here's perfection. God completely possesses all excellent qualities and lacks no part of any qualities that would be desirable for him. Everything good, true, perfect, and beautiful, God has it. He is perfect. He's not incomplete. Another way of thinking about perfect is completion, a telos or end. Something is complete or something is perfect, accomplished. So God lacks nothing in terms of quality or perfection. But we're also called to be perfect. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's the standard. That's the command. Lack nothing. Be perfectly like God. So hence the severe need for grace. But that nonetheless is the standard. Next one is happiness or blessedness. So like in the Greek, there's this word makairos, which is often translated blessed. Like in the Beatitudes, blessed is the poor in spirit. Makairos, I think, is actually best translated as happy or joyous. Happy is the one who's poor in spirit. What does that mean? But that God is a happy God. I think that's hard for us to wrap our minds around sometimes. We just see him as like upset and frustrated, or as like an angry dad, but God is happy. Makairos, he's blessed. And that's not just like he's blessed when we bless him, but he's dispossessed positively. John Piper has a few different books on the happiness of God that I think some of you more fussy types would be blessed to read. 1 Timothy 1:11 says this: the gospel of the glory of the happy God, the blessed God, that God is pleased and delights in his creation. Isaiah 62:5, as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. That he's a rejoicing, singing, delighting, happy God. And we're called to delight in him. Something is wrong when we are perpetually unhappy. That's not to say that there aren't things we're supposed to be unhappy about. That's not to say that we don't weep or sometimes, but generally speaking, gratitude is the marker of our existence. Next is beauty. God is the sum of desirable qualities. So there's beautiful in spirit, there's beautiful in body. Nothing wrong with wanting to be beautiful, because God's beautiful. We're called to be beautiful like him. One thing I've asked the Lord, that I'll seek after, that I might dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Amen with me. To gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple, to see the radiant, unsearchable, unfathomable glory of the Lord, his light and his magnificence and his majesty. This is what we are hoping to do. The beatific vision is what the church fathers called that, like the vision to see God's beauty with our heart, not just our eyes. We have moments of that in our lives, but to do that eternally is the thing we aspire to. And last, glory. God's created brightness that surrounds God's revelation of himself. Glory most means weightiness or severity. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment. It's kind of like trying to look at the sun. You can't really look at it, but you see the light coming from it. It's similar with looking at and beholding our Father in heaven. God is glorious. And so we should also aspire to glory, to be people of light, to be people of weightiness, who have a presence that affects the world around us. Significance is another way of thinking about glory. We should be beautiful, significant, holy, perfect, patient, abounding, steadfast love, be imitators of God. Reflect on this list, be convicted of your sin, and trust in the grace of Jesus.